after I just made a few opening comments with a subject I've been thinking about the last couple of days, I'll open the floor to all of you. And I'm interested in what you think, what your experiences are, questions you have, and perhaps what you know. Because I was reflecting this morning, maybe even yesterday, about how we're going to start, what subject I'd talk about. And I always go through my mind the last show. And I do remember saying, there's a huge difference between what we think and what we know. And this is a comment you'll have heard me say many times, because it really doesn't matter how many times you say it. It doesn't really matter how many times you hear it. It always feels a little bit different. And the problem is that because we're sentient beings, we do so much thinking, and thinking pretty much has to be in our conscious mind. And when our conscious mind is very busy, and most of our conscious minds are increasingly busy, we have very little, if any, opportunity to connect to the much more powerful, deeper unconscious mind, which is the home of our instincts and emotions, and also our intuition. And intuition is possibly our greatest gift. So what you think is normally not that close to reality, because we think in terms of words as well as pictures, and they're always abbreviations and generalizations, and distorted by our own view of the universe. So the less thinking we do, the more Zen-like we become, and which is literally translated is no mind. The more mindless we become, and the more we can connect to the deeper layers. And that's where we get rid of our stress. It's where we relax, and it's where we find the person that we were supposed to be, until people started interfering with us, which happens at about the age of 3 and sometimes even younger. Now, what we know, we will find pretty hard to put into words, because it is coming from deeper. And what we know is usually a universal truth. And it's not a million miles away from the infinite intelligence that we've mentioned in previous meetings. Now, if I remember correctly, in the last show, I said the problem with modern education, at least in this country, is that the education is focused on remembering stuff. And these days, as never before, what we can remember is not that valuable. I mean, whenever Ludwig would know this, whenever I'm on a TV set or a film set, the technology is getting so advanced now that it's supposed to be foolproof and work under all conditions. But very often at a critical time, the camera, there'll be some software problem with the camera, and the camera operator will be shouting, "Anybody ever seen this problem before? Anybody know what I do?" And people would shake their heads and say, "Just Google it, mate, look on YouTube." And sure enough, within about 10 seconds, yeah, I've got it, everything's working fine. So what we remember is not that important. And as a doctor, what I remember is not that important, because even when I was sort of hands-on, I think I probably remembered 5% or less of what I learned at medical school. But I remembered, or I knew so much from my later years as a medical student, when we were being groomed to take over, and certainly my time as a junior hospital doctor. And so when you're in an emergency situation, you don't need to spend a lot of time thinking, because you just know. So there we are. I've gone on about that a bit more than I felt, and I haven't quite finished, because it takes me back to my school days. And I hope that education has moved on a lot since then, but sometimes I hear that it hasn't, sadly. And there were two things that I remember. I had it in my last 3 years at a junior school, we call it a primary school. At the last 3 years, I had one good teacher and 2 monsters who frankly should have been in prison. They were bullying sadists, and they would know how to do the mental torture of children who were not able to stand up for themselves. And the common one they used to say was to me and to anybody in the class who was, doesn't know the answer to a question, they'd say, well, I think you need to go and see your brother who's 2 years below you and ask his class, because I bet all those kids will give you the answer. Well, you can feel how that, you can imagine how that makes you feel. And the other thing they would say is they'd ask you a question and you'd be trying to figure out what the answer was. And they'd say, there's no point you staring at the ceiling. You won't find the answer written there. Anybody have heard things like that before? Well, you see, the truth is that that's exactly where you will find the answer. Because I mentioned on my little taster on Facebook, I said, our eyes are really good for seeing stuff, but they're even better at some other stuff. I wonder what that could be. Well, those of you who've had any NLP training almost certainly will have heard about I cues, I as in I, and cues as in C-U-E-S, like you get in the acting profession, a cue. And Richard Bandler and his John Grinder, who they worked together, putting together the structure of what NLP was going to be, they noticed that when people were asked a question or thinking a certain way, their eyes moved in a certain direction. And it depends, which direction depends very much whether you're left or right-handed. So you need to be a little bit careful before you start jumping to conclusions once you start using these IQs. But typically when the eyes will go up there to the left, which is my left here, what I'm doing is I'm searching my memory banks. I'm looking for the answer to the question. And that's why I'm looking up at the ceiling there to see if I can remember what I was going to say next. Now, if I'm looking up over there, what I'm doing is I'm creating something new. I'm visualizing something new. And who knows what that might be. But that's, you know, where I really should be, because that's probably where infinite intelligence is going to be hiding somewhere. And then if we go back, if I'm looking to the left, straight to the left like that, then that means I'm accessing my auditory banks. I'm accessing stuff that I've heard before. It might be noises, it might be music, but it's going to be in the past. And if I'm looking to the right, I'm imagining something. So if I was trying to compose a piece of music, or possibly even if I was going to try and change my voice to speak in a slightly different way or put on an accent, the chances are that at some point my eyes would move in that direction. And down to the left, that is a connection to a feeling. It'll be a kinesthetic type thing. And that can be a little complicated, but I'll move on. And if my eyes move down to the right, and whether we remember this because we say down right, because people who are feeling bad will say, I feel downright terrible right now. So if you're working with somebody who is looking down here and you've worked out whether they're left or right-handed and which way these things work, you've got a very good clue as to how they're feeling. And it's interesting because you can tell when there's a disconnect, when somebody's telling you something and their eyes will be revealing the truth. So actually they're lying. I mean, that might be a harsh word. They may not think that they're lying. They're putting together probably a sanitized version of what they're trying to say. And as you know, I work with some of the top poker players in the world, and we spend a lot of time talking about IQs, because as far as I can gather in the world of professional poker, there's very few people who know about them. And those of you who play poker will know that it's a game of bluff and counter bluff. And so if somebody is trying to look very confident and they're putting a lot of money into the middle of the table because they want you to believe they have a good card, if their eyes are going to the right, the chances are that they're not, because they're imagining what a good card would look like. So that can be very valuable. So there we are. That's a bit about eyes. Interesting. And my final comment on eyes is that they can be even better or in a different way than actually seeing stuff. Because I've given a couple of clues before that if we're feeling stressed just before we're about to go into an important job interview or to sit an examination or difficult meeting with the boss or whatever it might be, things that might stress you, if you were to stare at a point, and certainly as an actor or when I'm on TV as a guest on a show or something, those last few seconds before we go live, as I am doing right now, I will be staring exactly at the middle of the camera. And obviously I wouldn't be talking then. And in a matter of seconds, it starts to take your mind into a different place. As I've mentioned, it's like being drawn into the lens of the camera, like you're being drawn into an inviting pool to have a swim. So it's an altered mental state, which is almost like, or maybe exactly like a hypnotic state. It's certainly a relaxed state. And I've talked about in the past about healing as well, and the training that I had with Dr. Eric Pearl. The last time that I saw him, you know, he made the point, and I never heard him say that before. He'd say, heal with your eyes. Typically, we're taught to gather the energy or channel the energy, or however we like to describe it, using our hands in some way. But he would just say, you know, don't use your hands, don't use your arms, just use the power of your eyes. Imagine that your eyes are pouring forth energy. And just to make it a little more complicated, of course, many people believe that we have a third eye. And if you can get the feeling of the third eye, then and you have your two eyes and your third eye, you're giving like a tripod of healing energy to another person. Sounds fanciful, but I would just say, try it out and see what you think, because the strange thing is that this often works, and the person doesn't need to be with you. They can be the other side of the world. So there's more to life than we understand, and this is where I would normally go into the quantum physics, but we did that last week, and I've only just recovered from it, so I won't do that. So those were my idle thoughts this morning when I thought, well, I'm not sure what Ludwig's going to say, but assuming that he doesn't say this all himself, which I didn't think he would, then I think that's probably what I'll start with. So this is where I welcome your comments, questions, experiences, and we just go, and then we all find out what journey we're going to be on tonight. What is the path that this show is going to take? And what subjects are going to manifest? And what learnings are going to manifest? And what are the things that we're going to think? And what are the things we're going to know? So what have we got? Who wants to speak first? Who's going to be the brave one?
Yes, we have a question from Amy. Hello, everyone. I would like to ask Stephen, what do you mean when you say knowing? Do you mean certainty? How would you describe the difference between certainty and believing? Thank you. Thank you, Amy.
Yes, Amy, thank you. That's a good question. How do I know? Well, there will be some things I guarantee that all of us will know. They might be fairly trivial. And it is a certainty. It's a near certainty, about as close as you can get. You can have a knowing of something that's going to happen in the future. Often it seems to be, as children, we quite often get that. We just knew something was going to happen. I think maybe kids are more open to that. If we start thinking we know what's going to be in the future, you know, Mr. or Mrs. Ego takes over and says, well, that's, you know, stupid. That's nonsense. But there will be some things in your life that you know. I mean, if you have a partner and you're in a happy relationship, then you know that that person is right for you. Don't need to think about it. You know when you feel good in yourself. When you start thinking, am I feeling good in myself? That's just a thought. Thoughts come and go. Knowing is ever present, although we're not always aware of it. I would say that we're knowing I would say that we're knowing beings all the time if our head's in the right place. We know enough. So, Amy, that might have confused you even more, but hopefully it might have helped you to try and at least understand what I was trying to say anyway, my view of knowing. And feel free to come back to me if you have any subsidiary questions. Oh, I can see the message now. I don't normally look at the text box. Amy says, thank you. Okay, great. Thanks, Amy.
Okay, any other questions? Or something to share? If not, I have some. Today on my actor's path, I did read a book. It's a book I told you about. It's Artist Way. And there's a sentence from Albert Einstein. And he said, imagination is more important than knowing, than knowledge. And I think this is what we talk about today. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I don't think, well, when we talk about imagination, this is the stuff where you're trying to make some new thought, some creative thought. And Einstein uses the word imagination, which is a good word. And when he says, you know, I think imagination is more important than knowing, that's the words that he would use. But how I would put it into sort of my map, I would say imagination is more important than what we think, or what we think we know. Because imagination, there's no boundary around it, there's no box around it. Imagination is infinite. Just depends how far you trust yourself to go by using the imagination. What about Ludwig? Is that what you take? Is that your take on it?
Yes, thank you. It's for me. It's another look on this sentence, and it's really useful. Thank you. Okay, we have another question, Andrea. Stephen, how would you suggest developing this gift of knowing?
Yeah, that's the question really we all ask ourselves, isn't it? I think it's one of these counterintuitive things. The more we try to understand what knowing is, the further away we're going to move from it. The more we try to find the zone of peak performance, the more we struggle to find it, the further we're going to go. My answer to questions like this, and they come up very, very often in different ways, is pretty much always the same. This is a quote from somebody, and I can't remember, looking that way, I can't remember who it's from, but he said, the truth can only be found in silence. And it's a bit like the Zen quote that I think I made yesterday, or the last week or the week before. There's nothing more certain to interfere with the straight flight of an arrow than a single thought. So anything that will quieten down conscious mind, ego, is going to bring you closer to the font of knowing, of knowingness. And so, the word that comes up every time, the subject that comes up every time, meditation is as good a way as any of finding it. Yoga, breathing exercises, any technique that we have found over the years that works for us is going to move us closer in the right direction. And if we don't like doing all those things, or we find them difficult to do, or don't have the time, another good way that is pretty much universally leading to knowing is to do something that you really like doing, that just engrosses you. We've mentioned, artists know all about this, and performers know all about this, because they follow their passion, and they know that the more they let go, the greater their performance can be. And the more they try to sort of drive the performance and be in the right place at the right time and say the right things, the performance is somehow leaden. Letting go is a common expression. Getting out of my own way is another one. So, Andrea, that's my take on how we can become better at knowing, by doing these things. And I know, and we'll say them time and time again. And it doesn't matter that I say them time and time again and other people say them time and time again, because some people will get these ideas really, really quickly. But most of us, including me, it seems to be that I absorb this stuff, and the more times I hear it, I don't think that I've changed my thinking in any way, but I know that I have, because it's only when I look back and I realize there is more stuff that I know now than I used to, and things that I found very difficult, subjects, for instance, like understanding the three principles. I can't say that I totally understand it now by a long way, but I understand more of it now. And I'm able to extrapolate three principles and say, well, look, there's nothing in here really that isn't in Buddhism or other philosophies or religions. There are common threads that go through so many parts of the culture of human life, wherever we come from, whatever part of the world we're in. So did that help?
Ludwig, can I jump in with something?
Yes, of course. I was waiting for Andrea, but she's writing something, so
okay, sorry.
So it's yours, Johnny.
Okay, I was just going to say that I think between thinking and knowing, we get a lot of omens, and so when we've got a lot of, say, questions within our own mind, there are events, be it through people, that will gravitate us to guide us to knowing the difference between thinking and knowing. I can think of an experience that when life was great, I was sat on a train on the way to work at 5 a.m. No one was on the train, and a guy got on the train who was he was drunk, and he sat opposite me, and he just started to talk to me whilst I was reading the FT, and we started talking, and he basically told me a story about his life, and he used to be an ex-city worker, and something happened in his personal life. But at the time, I didn't really, I listened attentively, but because I think I was riding the crest of the wave, I didn't associate much with myself. And when I look back now, I can see there was like a hidden message. Me meeting a guy at 5 a.m. in the morning, and he'd done a similar job. So I think life does guide us. And I think, Steve, when you say about being in a good headspace, quiet, you can connect the dots a lot better. And you don't let the ego think, oh, that will never be me. So I think there is always a guiding force. And the quieter our mind is, we can see the signs.
That's a great observation, Johnny, and you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought of omens, but and those guiding lights, but I definitely agree with every word that you say. And while you were talking towards the end, it just reminded me of another expression that I use from Carl Jung quite regularly, and that is synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those of us who have eyes to say. Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those of us who have eyes to see. And synchronicity is another word for luck. And when we are on the metaphorical path that feels the right path, we start the journey with knowing lots of problems and things that are going to get in the way of whatever it is that we think we want to do, or that we know that we want to do. And it's almost as if the path changes course and takes us direct. It's almost like a short circuit to where we want to go and where we're going and where we're going to be, where we're going to get. So yeah, synchronicity is another word that means the same thing. Now, I did have a chat that I did want to read. Okay, and the question was, would I talk about gut instinct? I definitely would. And that's a phrase that I, again, would use quite often, although I haven't used it today until just now. But people, when they're describing this thing that they know, they will be recounting. They will say, I was in this situation and I just knew what I had to do. And they'll start rubbing their stomach, possibly, and they'll say, I just had this feeling in my gut. It was like a gut instinct telling me what to do. And those can almost always be relied on, because that is a very strong intuition, because it's visceral in nature. So that is really an intuitive thought that is shrieking to be heard by your conscious mind. And the other way that people will describe things like this is that, I knew in my heart that this was the right thing to do. Or if they're in a bit of a dilemma, they'll say, well, my head was telling me to do one thing, but my heart was telling me to do the other. So these are all sort of like clues to the knowingness, and they can be very, very valuable. And that's why it's so valuable, finding a way, whichever way we're going to choose, to connect more closely to our deeper unconscious, which is what some people call infinite intelligence, or your higher self, or whatever words you might choose. And another little thing that I wanted to mention this in my intro, but as usual I forgot. I always forget at least one thing. But we were talking about the I cues, and I was talking about downright. There is this man that we've mentioned before, Dr. Milton Erickson, who is not alive now, but he's regarded as the father of modern medical hypnosis, and he was a psychiatrist. And as any psychiatrist, he saw lots of people who were chronically depressed. I mean, that's a great label for somebody, isn't it? Oh, you're a chronic depressive. Mind reads that, I'm going to be like that for the rest of my life. There's no cure for me, there's no help for me. Anyway, he kind of, I don't know whether he knew about the eye access cues, but for the chronic depressives, he would give them a mission. At the end of the consultation, he would say, right, I want you to walk home today, or if it's too far, I want you to get off the bus or the train, a couple of stops before you normally would, and I want you to walk from there. And I want you to walk in with a special mission, a task for me, because I'm going to ask you next time I see you. I'm going to ask you to count the number of chimneys that you pass on each side of the road, and tell me when we meet next month, whenever it might be, when I have my chronic depression clinic. And the funny thing was that they would come back and he would say, how many chimneys did you count? And the person would say, 63. And then he would say, how did you feel then? And they said, oh, funny you should say that, but actually when I did get home, I felt a bit better. I thought maybe we'd had a good session that week or something. And you see, what he'd done is he'd got them to look up so that they were, had a more open view of their life in what they could remember and what they could, and more importantly, what they could imagine. And I remember I was interviewed a few years ago live on Sky because the England cricket team had lost a series, every match in a series to Australia, which seems to happen every few years. And they wanted me to speak on what was wrong with the English cricketers and their mindset. And they particularly wanted me to know if I approved of getting rid of the captain, Alistair Cook. And everybody else was crying, baying for him to go. But I said, no, why? Anyway, that's by the way. But it was Lorna Dunkley who was interviewing me. And she went bang straight with the first question. She said, what would you tell the English team to do if you were in charge? Would you tell them to pull their shoulders back? And, that was exactly how I was going to start. So there was like a second of, what am I going to say now? Because you've stolen my words. And then I came right back in and I said, well, funny you should say that, but that's exactly what I would say to them, because I see these English cricketers. I mean, it's a miserable day in England at the moment. It's freezing, as I know, because I'm doing an outside broadcast, and they're in a beautiful climate, staying in a beautiful hotel, playing a game that supposedly they love, and yet they don't look like they're enjoying it at all. So I would say, pull your shoulders back and look up, because the body, we know about the IQs, but body language itself, the models call fake it until you make it. If you stand tall, if you pull your shoulders back, your height, make yourself as tall as you possibly can be, and walk like that, it starts to rub off on you and you start to feel better, just like the people did, the chronics who are looking at the chimneys. So never remember that something that sounds so simple can be very, very powerful. We tend to take simple things for granted, so much so that we don't use them, and we should use things like that more. We should use posture and body language more. And while I'm speaking, you probably I'm making me feel guilty. I'm trying to sit a bit more upright in my chair. So, can't remember how we got there now. If I answered a question, that's good. If I didn't, then please remind me or come back to me again. What else do we have?
I can't see any questions or sentences to share. Okay, Andrea wants something to say.
From what you're saying, Stephen, it sounds the Erickson's approach sounds a bit like the mindfulness that we're hearing so much about at the moment. Would you compare the two?
I would. I'm not even sure that I like the expression mindfulness, actually, but that's not important. I like the technique of mindfulness. I think if I had to give it another name, and people wouldn't like this, I'd call it mindlessness, because I think it's like Zen. I mean, Zen means no mind, would be better, but mindfulness. There's a lot of meditation techniques in it. It's taking your attention from one thing that is not being very helpful to you in your life, and partially it's a distraction technique because it's forcing you to think of something else. And there's a very small limit of how many things we can think about at the same time. I think the experts, they say 7 is the maximum. And I mean, you can have people who are in acute anxiety and chronic anxiety because they're worrying, they say, literally every second of every day. Now, they're not. They'll tell you that they are, but you do have to press them in a gentle way on this and say, has there been any time at all today, even if it's only a few seconds, when you weren't worrying about usually the what if. And they'll say, well, there was one. It'll be grudging. Yeah, there was one. Well, what was it? I don't know. Well, it was my dog. The dog made me do something that made me laugh or made me smile. Well, that just shows that anxiety doesn't have to be 100% full on, just like the chronic depression doesn't. Okay, the patients have been told that. This is the way you are. It might be your genes or something. But, and of course, that becomes a self-fulfilling hypnotic suggestion. Wasn't meant like that, obviously. just reminds me of another time. The last time I was in a psychiatric hospital, I was actually there to play cricket. And there was a friend of mine who was driving the car. And this was this typical Victorian psychiatric hospital. I mean, beautiful buildings, wonderful gardens and grounds, which is why there was a cricket pitch there. And there was a small outbuilding that had obviously been put there more recently and certainly wasn't the same quality. And it said the Eating Disorders Clinic. There was a sign on the door, Eating Disorders Clinic. And then underneath there was another sign, Gone for Lunch. I just couldn't stop laughing. So anyway, if you can laugh about an eating disorder, you can laugh about anything. Of course, eating disorders are serious, just like anxiety and depression are serious. But if you can break your mental state once, it means you can break it twice. If you can do something twice, you can do it 10 times. If you can do it 10 times, you can do it 1,000 times. The problem is that people get into habits. People get into habits of feeling bad, feeling downright bad about stuff. So Lorna Dunkley, they need to go and see Lorna Dunkley, and she'd tell them to pull their shoulders back and keep them like that until their shoulders hurt. And their shoulders would hurt, but they might not be feeling so miserable. I'm not trying to be too simplistic here. I'm just saying, let's try some of these simple things before we immediately put people on Prozac and everything else.
Thank you. That my mind's quantum jumping into manifestation, because looking at the chimneys or seeing what is there for us, the abundance of what is there for us. So if we're concentrating on what there is in abundance for us, then we're going to be improving, let's say, our outlook. So yeah. Okay.
I definitely agree, Andrea, and I'm so much in my imagination at the moment. I can't remember what question you asked me, but what came out, hopefully was, this higher self speaking. It wasn't Steve who's being an idiot. So and manifestation, yeah, it says in The Secret. I'm not a huge fan of The Secret, by the way. There's some good stuff in there, and there was, there's 3 words that I remember about The Secret, and they might well be the nugget. And it said, "Thoughts become things," and I think all of us, one way or another, believe that. I don't know anybody who's achieved great success without having a picture in their mind, or some kind of motivation urge that came from a deeper center that helped them to get what they wanted. I mean, that's why psychologists spend so much time talking about visualization with their clients, particularly people who are performers or sports people. And we live in a universe of yin and yang. So it also leads me to think, be careful what you think about. Because the person with the chronic anxiety is thinking about the what ifs, and they're always thinking, they never think about what if this happened, I won the lottery. It's always what if this disaster happened. And that definitely can become habit forming. And it's a cycle that requires breaking one way or the other. Be careful what you wish for. And just as Andrea, you would be wishing for abundance. What about people who are trapped in scarcity, the world of scarcity, and they're thinking that scarcity is going to happen? Or what about this virus thing that's going around the world at the moment? It seems to me that the authorities are doing the best they can to make us all frightened of this virus, and I can understand why. I guess they think that if we're all frightened, we'll follow the instructions that we're given, and we're very, very compliant. But the trouble is that some people are becoming more than frightened. Actually, they're becoming terrified. And even now, that many parts of the world that we're starting to get back to some kind of new normal. I don't think the old normal will ever be here again, but trying to make the new normal work. There are some people who still actually daren't go out of their own houses. And there's kids, the kids who've been in lockdown, schools closed down and all the rest of it. Goodness knows what mental, let alone physical traumas some of those kids might have. These are the kind of things we're going to have to clean up in the months and years to follow. Yes, Ludwig, I saw a message from somebody. I didn't catch it. Perhaps you could help me.
We have a question from Laura. Please, Laura.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you perfectly, Laura.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so along the lines of attracting better rather than, I suppose, putting out an energy and therefore attracting something that's not better or bad, I thought occurs to me, I don't know if you know anything about this, about kind of how the Stoic philosophers would think about protecting themselves, you know, by kind of keeping in mind the worst thing that can happen, and using that as a way to, I don't know, to kind of be prepared, if you like, for that eventuality happening. I mean, in one way, the thought occurs to me that that's a kind of a good way to kind of, oh, at least I know the worst can happen, I can prepare for it. But in another way, isn't it almost a self-perpetuating bad philosophy that you're kind of perpetuating? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, Laura. I obviously know a bit about Stoicism, but I'm not an expert in that area. But the way you describe it, I think, is a really good summary of the various things that I've heard. And in business or in life, we often talk about preparing for the worst case scenario. And I guess if you're running a big organization, or frankly just running yourself, you do have to give some thought to the worst case scenario, assuming that there's something that you could do that would help mitigate it. Now, as far as this virus is concerned, yeah, there's a worst case scenario that some of us will catch it. And I know people who have. And some have said, well, it's pretty nasty. It's a nasty cough and cold and all the rest of it. And it, in bed for a week, but then I was okay. And some people, as we know from the news, and even personally, they're in hospital and they're on ventilators, and some of them don't get out again. So what can we do to prepare ourselves against being on a ventilator? Well, that's the worst case scenario. Obviously, really, I think we can do our best to make sure we don't get infected. But after that, my worst case scenario, I don't think any more about it. I don't want to. I don't want to go to bed at night thinking I'm going to be on a ventilator the next day. I've seen enough patients on ventilators that I wouldn't recommend it to anybody.
Yeah. I mean, but sometimes in life, we can be given, as it were, warning signs that, oh, is this a sneak preview of something bad that's coming down the track? And it kind of, we're full of flight and fright, if you like, aren't we, as human beings? And we can kind of catapult into this chained reaction of preparation for the worst eventuality. And that's very stressful. It's not very Zen, is it? No, but then we're trying to be that fight and protect ourselves, isn't it? So there's a kind of a battle, isn't there, going on? There
is a battle, and this
within us.
Yeah, this is the eternal battle, Laura. You're absolutely right, and it's not very Zen. That's for sure. Now, Zen doesn't mean you just have to sit back and accept everything that life throws at you. It is wise to think of sensible things that you can do to avoid this worst case scenario. But there comes a point where what will be. I mean, I don't want to end this show on a really morbid note, and we're definitely going that way at the moment. But I mean, the whole world, the way it is at the moment, we're 1 second away from nuclear holocaust the whole time. I mean, nuclear reactors could just blow up by accident, which is bad enough. But there's absolutely zero that you or I can do about it. So why waste a thought? Those thoughts, I mean, if we can only have 7 thoughts at a time, let's make at least 5 of those really good. Like, if where we are in UK now, it's sort of early evening. And so tomorrow, we should start thinking about tomorrow. What do we want to do tomorrow? You know, we know we've got some things to do that we, you know, wouldn't choose to do, but that's just the way life is. But there's going to be some free time. How can you use that free time? How are we going to start to feel good about that? So it's you know, this is the way the mind is. Ego will always drift down to the critical and the bad. That's why egos know ego. But just by knowing, you know, that's the game that ego plays. It sees itself as the great defender of ours. It doesn't believe that we are really capable of living on our own. But we are. And when bad stuff happens, we're pretty resilient. When bad stuff happens, funnily enough, that's when we find the zone. Sometimes, for some people, it's the only time in their life when they felt this. And they've been really surprised how they've been able to get through the other side of whatever it was. So we don't have to, I'm mindful of time now, so I think we have to wrap up now, but I definitely want to leave this on a high that we have more influence over events and how we're going to react to events than we give ourselves credit for. So, you know, don't be modest. Start thinking good about yourself and what you can do, and that you will be tested, and that you will be up to the test at least. Because if you're not, that would be an insult against the evolution or creation that's made you the magnificent human being, a member of the human species that you are. We're hardwired and soft-wired to deal with stuff, good and bad. All right, well, my thanks to all of you for turning up. I know there's lots of other stuff to do on a Thursday night, but inshallah, I'll be here next week, and I hope you will be as well.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Ludwig.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Ludwig. I thought you were much better than Greg, but please don't tell him.
I won't. You're going to call me today, and I won't. Okay, maybe a little. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody. Bye-bye for now.